The Lake of the Woods Control Board presents 2022 flooding in the Winnipeg River basin. This video is the second in a three-part series covering the historic flooding in the Winnipeg River basin in 2022. The first video provided an overview of the 2022 flood and basic principles of hydrology and hydraulics. This video will review the 2022 weather, hydrology, and water level regulation. The final video will provide answers to some common questions posed to the board concerning this event and general regulation of water levels in the basin. Before examining the details of 2022, it's important to understand the water level situation in 2021. Following dry conditions across the basin that had developed in the second half of 2020, below normal precipitation for most of the first half of 2021 resulted in the worst drought conditions in decades across the basin. By mid-September, all of the Lake of the Woods drainage basin was in extreme drought, except for this portion near Winnipeg River, which was classified as exceptional drought, the first time this category has been reached in this region since classifications began. As the drought intensified over the course of the year, tributaries fell to extremely low levels. The large lakes across the region saw low levels as a result of limited inputs from the tributaries and low precipitation. Forest fires were widespread, with over 800 fires consuming more than 700,000 hectares in northwest Ontario alone. Seasonal rainfall in the last few months of the year helped to improve the drought situation to some degree, but most of the basin remained in moderate to severe drought conditions. With a few exceptions, flows of major tributaries and the inflows to major lakes were all lower than at least 90% of past years at that time. These low flows indicated extra capacity for the ground to absorb runoff. So, how did the basin go from this to this in a matter of months? The answer, of course, is precipitation, but how much fell and when? To understand how the basin went from these extreme dry conditions to historic flooding, it's helpful to visualize where and when precipitation developed in the winter and spring of 2022. This next section presents maps of precipitation derived from the Canadian Precipitation Analysis, or CAPA product, produced by Environment and Climate Change Canada. This product combines on-the-ground weather station measurements, radar and satellite data with sophisticated data processing to produce maps of precipitation across the continent. Shown here on the right is the input from the Environment Canada product for one day. On the left is a Lake of the Woods Control Board map that is created using the same data, but for a period of 1 week. Presented over the next several slides are two maps of precipitation that show how the flooding developed in 2022. On the left are precipitation maps for each quarter month beginning January 1st, and on the right a map showing how much the total precipitation since the start of the year differs from what is normal. On this map, colors in the blue, purple, and green range are above normal, and those in the yellow to orange range are below normal. All units are in millimeters of liquid precipitation. The year began with some light snowfall across the basin, with more moderate amounts accumulating by the middle of the month. The third quarter of the month brought the heaviest amounts of precipitation, and by the end of the month, slightly above average total precipitation year to date was accumulated across the region. These graphs show the total 2022 monthly precipitation in the blue bars and the average monthly precipitation in the orange bars for 4 of the large subbasins of the Winnipeg River watershed, including Lake of the Woods, Rainy Namakan, Lac Seul, and the Winnipeg River basin in Ontario. Each of these subbasins saw slightly above average total January precipitation in 2022. February continued with moderate snowfall amounts in the first 3 weeks. the heaviest amounts falling in the third quarter of the month. The last quarter of the month was relatively quiet across the basin. Total precipitation in February was also above normal for each of the subbasins shown here. The first half of March saw limited accumulation, with less than 10 millimeters total precipitation across the basin. And the last 2 quarters of March saw some more moderate precipitation, but not as much as in February. The highest amounts falling in the last quarter of the month, particularly around Lake of the Woods and the Winnipeg River. Total precipitation from January 1st to March 31st is about 25 to 75 millimeters above normal, with the highest amounts around the Whiteshell region. March is the third month in a row with above normal precipitation to start 2022, and these amounts range from roughly 25 to 50 millimeters of precipitation, depending on the subbasin. Winter, by the end of March, was colder than normal, though not a record, and warmer than the most recent high water year of 2014. There were no midwinter melt periods, however, meaning that aside from sublimation, most of the snow that fell remained until April. At the start of April, there was a significant amount of snow that had accumulated across the basin, with record amounts at Kenora and near Lac Seul, but more moderate amounts in the upper Rainy River basin. This table shows snow measurements made on April 1st at several locations across the basin. These include the depth of the snowpack in centimeters, and more importantly, the water content of that snow measured in millimeters. The last column shows the percent of normal of the water content of the snow. All areas saw above normal snow water content, with Kenora having the highest at over 3 times the normal amount to start April. As is typical for the first week of April, daytime temperature highs began to climb above freezing, and the first of the snowmelt gradually began. However, additional snow accumulated around the basin around the 6th of April, with heaviest amounts around the Rainy River basin. Total precipitation to this point in the year is now ranging from 25 to upwards of 100 millimeters above normal across the basin, with the heaviest amounts in the lower part of the Whiteshell region. Towards the end of the second week of April, the spring melt suddenly came to a halt. Temperatures plunged below freezing as the first Colorado low of the spring returned bare roads and sidewalks to white as heavy snow blanketed the region. Another Colorado low soon followed on the 22nd of April, this time bringing widespread rainfall across the region for 3 days. This event extended into the last quarter of the month, and another Colorado low brought even more precipitation, with heaviest amounts in the northern part of the basin. By the end of April, total precipitation year-to-date now ranges from 50 to 125 millimeters above normal across most of the basin. Total precipitation in April was several times the normal amount across all of these subbasins. This broke many records, including at Kenora, where total rainfall and total precipitation set new records. The first week of May brought only moderate precipitation to the basin, but 2 more Colorado lows were en route. The second week of May brought the heaviest amounts of precipitation of the season to much of the basin. Rainfall was heaviest over Lake of the Woods and Kenora, with up to 70 millimeters of rain falling. Half of that fell in just one day on May 9th. The third quarter of May brought even more precipitation, with the heaviest amounts centered along the English River and the Winnipeg River in Ontario and Manitoba. Total precipitation year to date is now exceeding over 200 millimeters above normal in some pockets, with many areas now above 175 millimeters. May closed with another wet quarter, the heaviest amounts falling in Minnesota. For the second consecutive month, total precipitation across these subbasins set new records, with double the normal precipitation. The combined precipitation in April and May also set records across all subbasins, with more than double the normal precipitation normally seen in these 2 months. June, normally the wettest month of the year in the basin, brought welcome relief with below normal precipitation in each sub-basin. July saw a return to wet weather with the highest monthly totals of the year. The following slides examine the effect this precipitation had in developing the historic flows in the spring. These graphs show the accumulation of precipitation from January 1st through to the end of August. The green line is the total precipitation in 2022, and the blue is what is normal. Across the region, above normal snowpack developed by the end of March, but in terms of total liquid precipitation, the amounts were a small proportion of the yearly total. The main driver of high water this year was the significant increase in precipitation beginning in mid-April and lasting until early June. This is true for all of the regions of the Winnipeg River drainage basin. Senior climatologist with Environment Canada, Dave Phillips, described it this way. These series of Colorado lows were lined up like jumbo jets in the airport tarmac, and they just kept coming one after another, crossing the province and bringing copious amounts of precipitation. There were 5 Colorado lows that I counted in April and into May, and these were drenching. They stalled. They just stood out like an unwanted guest and wouldn't leave, resulting in twice as much precipitation as the region would normally get during spring. That's just too much rain on the ground that wouldn't take it. It's almost a perfect storm of conditions that produce this kind of historic flooding. Discussed in the first video in this series, heavy rainfall falling on frozen, snow-covered ground results in rapid runoff of the watershed, as the water has nowhere to go but over land. The frozen ground prevents infiltration to the potential storage room in the soil. Cold temperatures limit evaporation, and plant uptake is negligible. The first Colorado low in mid-April dropped temperatures and brought heavy snow, setting the stage for rapid runoff across the watershed. The earliest states of emergency were due not to swollen rivers and lakes, but to overland flow that washed out culverts and roads and swamped basements. That runoff event was the start of a prolonged period of rising flows across the basin that would be continuously fueled by heavy precipitation for weeks to come. The following slides examine how water levels responded to these inputs. Starting after the first Colorado low in mid-April, the map shows the evolution of water levels over the summer and spring. Noted are high water levels in orange, peak water levels in red, record peaks in black, states of emergency in green, and evacuations in purple. With heavy rainfall around the border, the local tributaries to the Rainy River ran off early, quickly raising the level of the Rainy River and inflow to Lake of the Woods. 2 of the smaller tributaries set new records. Upstream, high water was beginning to develop in some areas. The first states of emergency were declared to respond to overland flooding at Fort Frances and Emo and Lake of the Woods County in Minnesota. With the runoff from April and new precipitation to start May, river levels rose in most regions of the basin to high seasonal levels. Only in the far northeast, where the melt was slower to develop, was the level not high by the start of May. Peaks for smaller tributaries in the Weichsel occurred at the start of the month. Conditions quickly deteriorated across much of the basin in the second quarter of May. New states of emergency were declared, and rivers feeding the English River downstream of Lac Seul set all-time records. At Lake of the Woods and at Namakan Lake, the water levels rose above their regulatory ranges. Localized flooding at Kenora prompted some evacuations. With more rainfall, the third quarter of May saw more states of emergency declared around northwest Ontario and in Minnesota. Evacuation was ordered in the Whiteshell in Manitoba. This week saw several new peak records around the basin, and the Root River diversion, which drains flow from Lake St. Joseph to Lac Seul, was closed on May 19th. Closing out May, most areas continue to see rising water levels. The Minnesota tributaries to Rainy River have run off and are returning to normal spring levels. Lac La Croix and Namakan Lake are the first to reach their peaks. Namakan the highest since 1916 and Lac La Croix the highest since 1950. At Grassy Narrows First Nation, an evacuation of some community members takes place. Entering June, several records are set along the English River and the Winnipeg River in Manitoba, as a combination of record-setting flows from tributaries and very high outflows from Lake of the Woods and Lac Seul work their way downstream. Lake of the Woods Township and Buffalo Point First Nation declare states of emergency as the level of Lake of the Woods rises above the 2014 flood peak. With drier weather developing in June, flows begin to slow, and a few tributaries in the upper Rainy River basin are no longer high. Lac Seul reaches a peak, as does Rainy Lake, setting a new all-time record. Water levels continue to drop in most upper tributaries in the basin in the latter half of June. This follows a general pattern of upstream to downstream, with the peak flows working downstream through large rivers and lakes where the levels remain very high. Outflow cuts begin at Lac Seul and at Namakan Lake as high levels end. Meanwhile, at Lake of the Woods, the highest peak since 1950 is reached. Entering July, above normal precipitation slows the decline in the large downstream lakes and rivers, but plant take-up and evaporation compensate to some degree. With more flow cuts out of Lac Seul, the level at Packwash Lake finally returns to normal. Rainy Lake returns to its rule curve range in the second half of July, and outflow cuts soon follow. This results in a sharp drop in the flows down the Rainy River and into Lake of the Woods, where the rate of lake level decline begins to pick up towards the end of the month. As the lake level drops, the outflow in Kenora gradually drops off, as does the level of the Winnipeg River. Lake of the Woods, the English River, and the Winnipeg River continue to see a steady drop in level as the last of the flood wave works its way through the system in August. But they remain well above normal, even as the rest of the watershed has returned to normal summer levels. Lake of the Woods falls back to the legislating operating range on September 6th, after 119 days of high water. However, flows along the Winnipeg River in Ontario and Manitoba remain high and are expected to return to normal later in September. In summary, over the course of the spring and summer of 2022, exceptional precipitation led to the development of new river water level records all around the basin. Of the major lakes, only Rainy Lake saw a new record level, but each of the major lakes saw new records for total inflow in April and May. The last part of this video reviews how the Lake of the Woods Control Board carried out its regulation duties in the winter and spring of 2022. The Lake of the Woods Control Board is responsible for the regulation of the water bodies shown here in purple. It does so by regulating the outflow from Lake of the Woods and Lac Seul. These are the only lakes the board regulates. The board also regulates run-of-river hydroelectric facilities along the Winnipeg and English rivers in Ontario. Unlike large lake dams, these facilities are constantly passing the river flow as it arrives, but can make small adjustments to influence the river level in the local area upstream of the dam. The board has no authority over the regulation of upstream lakes and rivers in the Rainy River Basin. The large lakes here, Rainy and Namakan, are under the authority of the International Joint Commission, which is not affiliated with the Lake of the Woods Control Board. The board also has no authority over the run-of-river facilities along the Winnipeg River in Manitoba. Normally, the Lake of the Woods Control Board carries out its regulation according to a strategy model. The board meets with representatives of various groups concerned with water level regulation in the region and discusses how to best regulate Lac Seul and Lake of the Woods should various inflow conditions from low to high develop over the coming season. The adopted strategies consider the balance of a range of interests on the lakes and the rivers, including properties, fish and wildlife, tourism, recreation, and hydropower. These adopted strategies are posted on the board's website, and the board's full-time staff, the Secretariat, direct the daily regulation for the board according to these strategies. When extreme conditions develop in the basin that aren't covered by the strategy, the board directs regulation on an emergency basis, meeting frequently to make decisions on outflow changes and to address critical issues. This was the case in the spring and the summer of 2022. Water level regulation of Lake of the Woods takes place primarily at the Norman Dam and Powerhouse. Pictured here are the northern log sluices with all logs in. In the next several slides, the regulation of Lake of the Woods level by the board is reviewed in 2022. The level is regulated by adjusting outflow primarily through this facility. To understand how levels were regulated and how the limits of regulation were exceeded, the standard Lake of the Woods Control Board graphs will be used. Shown here are the background statistics for Lake of the Woods level. The yellow band is the normal range of levels throughout the year. At any given time of year, levels have been higher than the yellow band 25% of the time and lower than the yellow band 25% of the time. 50% of the time, the level falls within the yellow range. The red lines represent greater extremes. Levels have gone above the upper red line in 10% of years and fallen below the lower red line in 10% of years. 80% of years fall between the two red lines. The inflow and outflow from Lake of the Woods will also be presented. The background statistics will be for the inflow in a similar manner as for the level, with the yellow range representing the normal and the red lines representing the extremes. With the ongoing drought in 2021, the level of Lake of the Woods fell below the 1 in 10 year low by August. While fall precipitation and some improvement in drought brought the level slightly higher, it remained below normal through to the end of the year. The extreme drought conditions are illustrated with the inflow plot shown here in blue. For much of the summer, the total inflow, after taking into account evaporation, was close to zero. In response to the extreme drought conditions, the board directed very low outflow from Lake of the Woods throughout the late spring, summer, and fall, with some increase towards the end of the year as inflows start to recover. The board gradually monitored the development of the snowpack and the temperatures around the basin, targeting a flat lake level in the low normal range. The board held a regulation meeting in early March to set the spring operating strategy. Among other factors, the board considered the underlying, though improving, drought conditions and the building snowpack in setting a lake level target for the beginning of April at the bottom of the normal range. This was to hedge against the possibility of higher runoff in the spring. To do so, the board directed gradual outflow increases through the winter and had a moderate outflow rate for the start of April, shown here in pink. At the close of the month, inflow to Lake of the Woods, shown in blue, was in the normal range. The start of April is a challenging time for lake level regulation. A dry month can result in a significant loss of snow to the air and low runoff, making refill of the lake challenging, whereas a rain-on-snow event causes rapid runoff and quickly rising levels. The board aims to anticipate and adapt outflow to the changing runoff picture to keep the lake refilling on target. By mid-April of 2022, the lake was refilling in the middle of the normal range, but the first two Colorado lows saw the picture change abruptly. April also presents unique challenges in terms of outflow changes from the lake. Because the ice is typically still on the river in April, large increases in outflow from the lake can cause damage to shorelines along the river, either directly by lifting docks and boathouses still locked in ice, or by releasing large ice sheets that flow into structures. For this reason, the board typically aims to limit the rate of river rise each week where feasible. Following the first Colorado low that passed through the region, however, with another soon to follow, the board recognized that the basin was in danger of a major flood event and began to direct larger, more rapid outflow increases as high inflows to the lake developed. This resulted in the river rising by nearly 5 feet in the last half of April. With the rapidly rising flows in April and May, control of the lake was quickly lost. The board, operating on an emergency basis by the start of May, directed continued large outflow increases from Lake of the Woods until the Norman Dam was fully opened on May 7th. Staging the last of these increases over several days was done to provide those along the river with some time to prepare for the rapidly rising levels. The river near Kenora rose by over 3 feet in the first 2 weeks of May, and by over 4 feet by the end of the month. As discussed in the first video in this series, when inflow to the lake is greater than the outflow, the lake rises, and this was the case from early April. But the difference between the two became very large after the second Colorado low passed through the region, and it grew with each additional week of rainfall. The inflow exceeded the maximum outflow capacity of the dams in Kenora towards the end of April. It's not unusual for the inflow in the spring to exceed the maximum outflow capacity of the dams, and this is one reason that the lake is drawn down to a low level before the spring begins, to create room for excess runoff. However, that storage room is not sufficient to handle many weeks of excessive inflow, and the lake quickly climbed above the lake's legislated operating range of 1061.25 feet. Once the lake is above the top of the legislated operating range, the board is obligated to maintain maximum outflow, and any changes to the outflow must be approved by a second board, the International Lake of the Woods Control Board. This board had authority once the level rose above 1061.0 feet on the 10th of May. Once the dams were fully opened in Kenora, there were no additional steps the board could take to slow the rate of rise. The lake level peaked around the end of June, once the inflow had dropped to match the outflow. With a wet July, the rate of inflow decline had stalled, but it picked up again towards the end of the month and continued through August, allowing the lake level to continue to drop through the month. As covered in the first video, the maximum outflow out of Lake of the Woods is dependent on the lake level. As the lake level dropped through August, so did the outflow from the lake and the level in the Winnipeg River. The lake continued to fall, entering the normal operating range on the 6th of September. Outflow reductions are planned by the board to return both the lake and the river to a normal range by the end of October. This concludes the second video in this 3-part series. The next video will address frequently asked questions about the 2022 flood event and water level management in the basin.